Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, presented to you by the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate at the Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The views expressed here are those of the individual and do not represent the views of the Combined Arms Center, U.S. Army, or U.S. government.
Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, a U.S. Army Combined Arms Center podcast on our Army's doctrine and vision of warfare. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Gregory, and I'm delighted to be here today as we talk large-scale combat operations at the Corps Echelon. We could not have asked for a better guest to help us walk through the complexities of warfare at the Corps than our guest, Lieutenant General Matthew McFarlane, Commanding General of America's First Corps, a lifelong soldier with an operational history that truly spans the globe. Sir, welcome to Breaking Doctrine.
Hey, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Additionally, on the net with us today is Mr. Rich Creed, the Director of the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate.
Thanks, Dan. Good to be here.
Gentlemen, thank you for your time today. Mr. Creed, I'd like to start with our doctrinal foundation, ATP 392, Core Operations. The book was last published in 2016, and much has changed since then to include how we, the United States Army, see our Corps commands. Could you set the stage on what the Corps Echelon is, what our doctrine asks it to do, and when we can expect to see an updated manual?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. What the Army's been asked to do in terms of its responsibilities to contribute to the Joint Force has changed a lot since 2016. The 2016 version of the book was a brilliant example of capturing all the lessons from Afghanistan and Iraq when our corps were typically operating as joint headquarters, or operating in such a way where they focus more as a headquarters rather than as a formation. And so right after, of course, we published that in 2016, the Army changed its focus because the operational environment's changed. The strategic geopolitical situation had been changing for some number of years, and we realized that the likelihood of large-scale combat operations against a peer threat like a Russia, a China, or even lesser threats like Iran or North Korea was more likely than it had been at any time since the Cold War, and that trend has only continued since then. So that book was really focused on the Corps as a headquarters executing its tasks in theaters like CENTCOM and in campaigns associated with our efforts in Afghanistan and Iraq. What we realized was that it is a completely inappropriate doctrinal focus for the Corps when we talk about conventional warfare, and large-scale combat operations is a conventional warfare problem. So we needed to change the focus from the headquarters to the formation and how the formation conducts operations, which requires some cultural shifts in our thinking. And I think we've largely made those changes. But when we talk about formations and you talk about a corps, you're talking about the divisions within the corps, those brigades and separate battalions that enable a corps that are task organized uniquely to every situation, right? And each of our corps is task organized differently because they tend to focus on different theaters. But they all have to be able to fight in all theaters, and so the doctrine needs to be sufficiently broad enough for the corps to be interoperable. And we address that when we talk about interoperability, right? That ability to task organize capabilities, light, heavy, using the old speak, mechanized armor, light infantry, various types of aviation, artillery, and then the new formations that we've fielded since 2016, like multi-domain task forces, security force assistance brigades, and so forth. So a lot of things had changed. And quite frankly, we've been working on this effort for almost 4 years, because every time we think we get it about right, some other things have changed. And so we've gone through an iterative process through multiple corps commanders in each of the corps and their staffs to get this book about right. And we think we're going to get it published by the end of the summer. We're on very short final, and we really appreciate the input we got from the corps. That's, I think, in short, where we were and where we're going.
Thank you for that. General McFarlane, could you take a second to explain to our listeners the purpose and mission of America's First Corps inside the Indo-Pacific?
Dan, absolutely. First Corps is focused on building warfighting readiness and optimizing our combined and joint training at home station and also across the Indo-Pacific AOR in order to deter our adversaries' aggression, and then, if needed, be prepared to deploy globally to ensure we prevail. And so we are focused on the Indo-Pacific. We got to be prepared to go any place, anytime based on the global security environment changing. But we're certainly laser-like focused on warfighting readiness at Echelon across the Corps to ensure adversaries know that they don't want to do the wrong thing, that we're ready to respond, both U.S. forces, but also all of our partners across the Pacific.
So great hearing about First Corps' linkage to that land power network. Well, I imagine given the distribution of your formations across the Pacific and all the bilateral and multilateral work they do with our partners and allies, there creates a challenge of synchronization to mission and purpose. Our doctrine talks about using commanders' visualization to help enable that. And given your AOR, I'd like to see how you get after that. But first, Mr. Creed, could you please set out the doctrinal foundation for our listeners?
Well, I mean, the big idea, I think, comes from FM30, but it's that first imperative, which is seeing ourselves, seeing the threat, and understanding the operational environment. And that's going to be entirely contextual, depending on whatever the situation is, either in a semi-steady state environment or one that becomes more dynamic because the threat is doing something and we have to respond, right? So I think that's the basis. And then our planning doctrine, which we touch on in the core doctrine as well, is this importance of, our decision-making processes are commander-driven. And so the commander has to have a vision for a desired end state, and that's going to come, whatever echelon you're at. And so the commander visualizes those things in time and space as part of whatever campaign plan or contingency that the Corps is being asked to execute. And it's really about communication, right? It's I've got to have the right information to see ourselves, to see the threat before I can start making decisions. And then I've got to link those decisions to purpose over time, right? So I've got a strategic purpose, I've got a theater strategic purpose, and then I've got the purpose that I've got to give my formations so that everybody has a unity of effort and a unity of command, and that we're doing things in complementary and reinforcing ways. And then I think that part of the commander's visualization and how we link that to an operational approach requires not just communications to the staff. The doctrine talks about the commander gives visualization to the staff, but because you have forces that are forward positioned, some semi-permanently, some rotating, they have got to really have that commander's dialogue with their higher headquarters before anything starts to happen, like the what if drill. If this happens, then what do we think we're going to do?
So I'll take that doctrine and apply it to practice to give you a sense for how often we're forward and what we're doing. Right now we have Pacific Sentry, an Indo-PACOM exercise going on across the entire joint team that comprises Indo-PACOM Command, where we have element in Japan, an element in Hawaii, a team in Guam, a team here at JBLM, executing land operations as part of the joint team. And so large exercise happening right now. As we're doing this, we have the 25th Infantry Division in the Philippines executing what we call Joint Pacific Multinational Readiness Center Exportable, JPMRC-X, as they're working with the Philippine Army to build interoperability and also build partner their capacity as they also get a rep and set training themselves in the jungle environment in Luzon. Simultaneously, we're planning operations, and I just had a VTC with the commander of the Ground Combat Command for the Japanese Ground Self-Defense Force 2 days ago as we're preparing for Yamasakura in August, which is our multilateral exercise that we do annually with the Japanese Ground Self-Defense Force. Last year, that was our warfighter exercise. So we did the Army's premier training event for Corps and Division headquarters for this Corps forward in Japan alongside our partners. And we're using these exercises to help us train, yes, but also to rehearse tasks we think we'll need to do as we continue to drive operations to deter China, but also be prepared for crisis or conflict. So thinking through the dynamics for power projection, what happens when you get there to build combat power, and how we'll need to operate alongside partners and allies in the region. And then last, planning for exercise Talisman Saber, which is part of our Pathways event, which is a large exercise here in July, large multinational exercise, the largest one in the Indo-Pacific. And so we are continually working to learn about each other, understand what that means, and then adapt our tools for the fight, if you will, to do that. In terms of visualization, how I do it technically, I use a command and feedback aspect. as a term. And then I establish priorities, which is basically identifying main efforts, supporting efforts across the board. I allocate resources, both lethal, non-lethal. Logistics resources is key as we look at how we organize and arrange that. And then I drive progress along the way. But those three key things are the command aspect, what we do to command. That part of that is also the written orders that come out. And then the feedback is the commander's dialogue that happens during Cubs, commander touch points, and targeting coordination boards that we do. All three is critical to ensure as we learn and adapt along the way, we are doing it at the speed of need, if you will, based on what we're seeing with enemy TTPs, enemy capabilities where they are, and what the guidance I'd given initially. So I can have commanders come back to me with feedback so we can refine any of those plans at any point along the continuum of our operations and our battle rhythm process. And then last is the internal assessments process. As we red team it, you have devious bastards or whatever you call them to give you things to think about in terms of how the enemy's going to fight. And then our internal ORSA assessments process is our assessments working group gets together to help provide input to how we need to refine and adjust any of the command guidance given to ensure we are continuing to drive and dominate.
Gentlemen, I'd like to pull the thread on this topic, as our doctrine says that the senior Army tactical echelon has a responsibility to create convergence. General McFarlane, you've just talked about bringing in our multinational partners, your subordinate formations that are spread all across the globe with multiple different entities and capabilities. How do we create convergence in that environment, given these technical challenges? But first, for our listeners, I'd like to kick things over to Mr. Creed to kind of explain what convergence is by our doctrine.
Yeah, so no topic causes more heated discussion, I think, than convergence. And it goes back to, it's one of the original ideas in the multi-domain operations concept. It started it was a multi-domain battle concept. We first rolled it out in 2022. We had a few years to experiment around with it. First Corps actually did a large part of the experimentation in a non-contiguous operating environment, which is good because the whole idea of convergence was the catalyst for that term, that idea, actually started with Indo-PACOM as the scenario for operating. Most people don't know that, but the multi-domain operations concept was not based on Russian aggression in Ukraine in 2014, 15, 16. The catalyst was how to demonstrate the relevance of ground forces or land forces in a operational environment that's dominated by big spaces, big maritime areas and a large amount of airspace. So what we did is we tried to take this conceptual idea that is nothing more than you've got to set conditions for success. And you've got to set conditions for success, not just of Army forces, but the overall joint force. And it required a little bit of a cultural shift for people to understand the idea, because it's not just about employing joint capabilities to enable maneuver by ground forces, but it also is applicable to the Army, which is part of the joint force. Right, that wasn't our experience really in the CENTCOM AOR for 20 odd years, because we were always a supported component. Everything the other services had was there essentially to enable our success on the ground. That's not the historical norm, right? And the historical norm is each of the services plays a role. And oh, by the way, Army, you're part of the joint force. And there's Army capabilities that you may be controlling, but all of the purposes for which they're employed is to support a joint plan. Right, you may be supporting the maritime component. You may be supporting the Marines. You may be supporting the Air Force. So that's the first thing. The second is we talk about the senior tactical echelon in the doctrine because it's the senior Army tactical echelon that's going to typically be in charge of the ground forces. And that means it's the senior echelon. Because it's the senior echelon, it'll be the first echelon that is authorized to employ joint capabilities and allocated those capabilities for employment. But again, the context could be very different in Indo-PACOM than it would be in Europe or in the CENTCOM AOR. Just because whatever point you are in the campaign, the preponderance of the joint combat power may be resident in the maritime component or the air component, or the requirements of that campaign, right, particularly early on, may be about defending what we have and helping our partners or allies defend what they have. right? So you have a very different dynamic there in terms of the application. But the big idea is really simple. It's about setting condition with all the tools that are available to enable you to achieve the objectives that you want to do. And so that has to be the senior tactical echelon that does that, because it's a senior tactical echelon that allocates those joint responsibilities that it does not control. So what are the components of achieving convergence? Well, you've got to determine what your friendly decisive points, right? Those important things that if they are not affected or you are not able to use them, you're going to have a problem. And you do the same thing with the adversary or the enemy, right? What are those things that are most important that we can attack? And some people default to thinking that it's all about targeting or it's all about employing joint fires or something. But there's a maneuver component to that. And then informally, and one of the reasons why we had to update the doctrine in 2025 was people had come up with some ideas because they were taking the doctrine and using it, and we needed to account for those ideas, this idea of convergence windows, right? You don't have unlimited ability to employ a capability. You may have magazine depth issues, you may have timing issues in terms of space capability, all kinds of things come into play. So then we talk about windows of opportunity, which drive you towards planning your operations a certain way. And really, say, we're talking about cores today, so within the core, every element of the core is either contributing towards achieving that convergence that creates an opportunity, or they're exploiting it, right? So some people were talking about consuming it, but it's really not consuming it. You're exploiting that opportunity that you create. And there's a timing aspect to that, right? Because you're employing joint capabilities. So it requires, in some ways, a simplistic view of determining what it is that you want to do and what you can do to hurt the enemy so that you can create this opportunity. But where it really gets to be the PhD level of planning and execution, synchronization and integration, is the timing of it. And understanding, going right back to seeing yourself, seeing the enemy, how do those joint capabilities work? When are they going to be available? And so forth. Well, the Army plays a role with that, because we are fielding a bunch of capabilities that will free up the joint force to focus on other things.
General McFarlane, what are some of the challenges that you're seeing facing your corps inside the Indo-Pacific's area of responsibility?
So first, based on our theater, the importance of the joint force, joint fires in the air and maritime domain can't be overstated. It is essential for us to survive in the fight, having the joint team around us, just based on the dynamics of the non-contiguous environment, the water that separates us, the reality of the contested logistics and the locks that exist there. So it's essential. And Rich, you were spot on in terms of articulating the dynamics and some of, frankly, our challenges with the term convergence in our leaders, Army leaders, being able to wrap their arms around it. It takes reps and sets to understand these very complex capabilities we have across the 5 domains. You got space, cyber, maritime, air, and ground. And so we are, Andy Knight, our Field Artillery Brigade commander, is just about to publish an article. It talks about our lessons learned of convergence in our warfighter. And in that there are critics of multi-domain convergence that say it's simply just planning or joint fires and effects planning, just at a larger scale. That ain't it. Well, some of the elements are the same. The reality is there's 2 key different mindsets. First, you have to have a detailed understanding of the adversary systems. In those adversary systems called a kill web, complex problem of anti-access, area denial, A2, AD systems that we all need to put some energy into making sure we are learning about our adversaries and the tools they have. Because just like we're modernizing and we're learning about some of these new things we have, our adversaries are doing the same. It's a technology race here as the character of war is changing based on what we're learning in Ukraine. And then being able to deliberately plan joint effects across all 5 of those domains. So understanding the adversary system. So we focus on China's system out here, and then how we are planning across our joint team, the joint capabilities we have across those 5 domains. And the joint team has a lot of capabilities. We were very good about Army capabilities. We need to learn more and faster to optimize all that the joint team brings to the fight. The other key point there is then the method of echeloning those effects or layering those effects in from tactical formations, joint force assets, theater and national capabilities, and then synchronizing them against this complex A2AD system. And so the capacity the Corps headquarters has with the battle staff we have enabled us as we reorganized based on these tools and the importance of being able to think deeper. We have a deep error planning cell now that we created and a multi-domain effects cell, which has joint membership in it, as well as space experts from the core team to drive all domain combat power at the right time to enable the maneuver and exploit what I'd call is a corridor for maneuver that they create. And so the lethal and non-lethal effects are just as important. And the technology we have is different than the ATO and the 72-hour request system. Some of these require an understanding of where things are in space and the timing of when that's going to happen, as well as the different dynamics with cyber capabilities we have. All are different, time horizons and create different effects. And you have to understand what those effects do to the things in the A2AD complex web that's out there to layer them at the right time. You got to avoid redundancies where you can, because there's only so much of these critical assets and effects that we have. So the more we can get people familiar with it, and it's hard because the classification is at a higher level. So some of this stuff is not what we're talking about, in the company team room or on the butcher block in the field. But we've got to figure out how to get there and integrate our leaders to make them familiar, and so they can contextualize this concept of convergence with real practical things. And it's going to be a journey for us. But what I tell people is, to adapt, you need to be learning adversary, our capabilities along the way, and being deliberate about that. And then case studies to apply, which I got to tell you, Rich, you and your team provide some great context throughout the new FM30 and all the doctrine you're publishing to give people context, but also to make their reading interesting, which did not exist when you and I were lieutenants in the Army, right? And so we're driving progress there, just in how we're allowing warfighting professionals to gain understanding, synthesize what they're reading, to then apply it to the fight.
So we always like to say that the Army doctrine influences joint doctrine. I'm up in the air, that battle never seems to be won. So it's like a 50-50 proposition. But I will tell you what is absolutely true is the joint force borrows our terminology. And the word convergence comes up quite a bit. So when we met with the Air Force last week to talk about air-ground integration, right, there's a lot of changes to force structure in both services, and that whole theater air-ground system is going to have to get updated. So I won't bore the audience with all the details of this, but what I found was that the service perspectives in terms of priorities can be very different because, where you stand depends on where you sit. And the Air Force was very focused in terms of addressing this problem of command and control, this air-ground integration piece, which incorporates space and cyber too, right? But their focus was all about being optimized for those pulses, which is understandable. When we brought up the point to them that, hey, when we're forward position in a theater like Indo-PACOM, and that was the theater we were focused on, you guys, and we didn't use that in a negative sense, but you guys, the Navy and the Air Force, you are pulsing combat power in, and then you have got to reconstitute that combat power because of logistics constraints or so forth, just to avoid being targeted, right? But you're not continuously there. So for the other 22 hours of day, we still got people forward in Luzon or Okinawa or on the Korean Peninsula. We still need to address this problem because we've got forces there, right? So the system cannot just support this one thing. It's got to support the joint fight that's going on outside of those pulses. And they hadn't been thinking about it that way. So I think we made a pretty strong case for them in terms of making this adaptable because it's applicable to the Corps or whatever, if the 25th ID TAC or whoever, whichever entity is forward having the command and control this fight, particularly early in the war, but it also has to be applicable in those other theaters where that dynamic is going to be geographically different and the way the joint force applies combat power may be different. So I just figured I'd throw that out there because it is related to convergence, but it's not all about convergence.
That is something we are so laser-like focused on creating the corridor to exploit and maneuver to hit a decisive point that we're forgetting large-scale combat operations is continuous over time. And what's that mean to ground forces where they are that may not have a pulse over them or protecting them or whatever? And so we're deliberate about what that means to us right now as we're still trying to figure out how to do that with organic capability, active protection, but also passive protection, displacing, digging in, using caves, which there's a handful in the Pacific for those that know history of what I'm talking about, right? And so how do you use the terrain to our advantage? The terrain in the Pacific is the most defendable terrain in the world. And we bore the brunt of that in World War II as we campaigned southern approach through Luzon and then up into Okinawa. It was brutal, and it's a defender's paradise. We've got to understand that and figure out how to optimize that terrain based on capability that we know we want, and it's taken time. But how do we use that to our advantage right now, just for protection?
When we talk about large-scale combat operations, people think it's large-scale because of the size of the formations, right? You've got multiple corps banging into multiple corps. When you talk about a theater like Indo-PACOM, the scale is not just the number of formations on a particular landmass someplace. It's the distance and number of those maybe smaller Army formations or Marine Corps formations or Japanese or Filipino formations that are spread out over all these distances. So the scale is as much about the command and control challenges of distance and timing as it is the number of forces on a particular landmass. And so I hadn't thought about it that way till you just brought that up.
Yeah, I tell you, not only the distance. I mean, this is my table in my office I'm at. I got a big Pacific map. There's an awful lot of blue. To give you an idea of the scale in terms of its weeks and months to move things in a theater on the surface, days and weeks if you're flying it in across from JBLM to the first island chain. In the first island chain in the Philippines, sovereign Philippine nation has 7,600 islands. I only have 20 green land masses there, 7,600 islands, but it has 2,000 of those are inhabited. And so the importance of understanding, and so getting between those islands, if you think surface, different Army watercraft we have, helicopters between them, but the scope and scale of the fight here and the dynamics of the Pacific, we are working hard to help people appreciate the different ways to operate this theater brings. It is way different, of course, than what we experienced the last 20 years in CENTCOM, what we're seeing and what we're doing in Europe and what we've done, obviously, historically in Europe. But the enormity of some of the challenges here, I can't be overstated. Contested logistics, I talked about, that the tyranny of distance is unbelievable. So being deliberate about what do we do during these exercises? We don't have any fixed bases, in the Philippines. We don't have fixed bases in many of these countries. We say places, not bases. What are we doing when we're operating there? So we get, environmental understanding during these operations for all different aspects of things we need to do. I mean, just operating, humidity, monsoon season, the extreme relief of the terrain, the restricted roads, the weight bearing of the bridges, are all things we talk about as we lead these exercises to make sure we understand the unique dynamics of all the countries where we are working with partner nations to help them, because we're helping them build capacity and focus on the areas they want to build capacity in. But we're also increasing our understanding. So if we do have to fight alongside a tree ally, we are ready to do it the right way the first time.
Gentlemen, there's been a wealth of information covered. I do have one question I'd like to throw to Mr. Creed based on your comments, General McFarlane. So as the practical applicator of our doctrine, your formation is experimenting and you're going through generating these lessons learned. And Sir, Mr. Creed, how does the U.S. Army capture these lessons learned and these experiments to then generate and transform into doctrine?
Sure. There's a whole bunch of ways. One, we send observers to every exercise we can get money to send people to. So we were at your Sakura last year. We go to all the MCTP warfighters. Obviously, we have access to all the after-action reviews from all these exercises, whether they're MCTP facilitated or not. We read those after-action reviews and disseminate them to the doctrine community. We review everything that the Center for Army Lessons Learned puts out, and they oftentimes are the ones that will create a handbook that are taking the common practices and just adapting that language, or actually not adapting it, using as it is currently being used by the force. And we'll see. Sometimes things are trendy turn of phrase that can be described using existing doctrine, and we don't need to incorporate those. There's no harm, no foul in people, putting a label on something because this is our game plan, right? This is our playbook. Most of our doctrine doesn't get into playbooks. There are some procedural things, but mostly we just get the ideas out there, and we expect the operational artists or the tacticians to kind of string things together in ways that make sense for their particular organization in a particular context. So we don't get hung up too much on, hey, this is an all-domain pulse, or, this is a convergence window, or any of those things, because we don't need to. The force has got its language that is applicable and understood by the folks in a particular context. And by the time we got that put into doctrine, somebody would come along and come up with a new one. So as long as those ideas are congruent, we don't necessarily need to capture them by name. As long as we capture the ideas, I think that's really the important part of this, because we don't want to hamstring the force. Doctrine is not a straitjacket. It's a point of departure for people to think about things. If they understand what our doctrine says, what the big ideas are, then coming up with different plays for a specific ball game against a specific opponent is perfectly okay. And we don't really get hung up about that. What we get hung up about, though, is if there's an idea that's out there that we have not addressed in doctrine, we really need to capture that and enshrine it in a way that the whole force benefits from it. I think that's, the big difference. If a certain playbook works in a certain theater, great. If a certain playbook works everywhere and it's not in doctrine, we better get it into doctrine.
Rich, your point about doctrine is not dogmatic. You take it and you apply the principles to what you're doing to make it work for you and your unit. I think often people will like to throw darts at doctrine, not realizing, one, they're supposed to help write it and they inform it. So sure. But two, you got to put the reality of whatever it is you're doing around it and wherever it is you're doing it. And one on that for young officers would be helpful, because I certainly wish I would have understood that better growing up. We grew up in the Army of air-land battle, and instead of realizing now that it's evolving, constantly evolving, and it's the best starting point we have is what you guys write. There is no better starting point, and often we just got to learn how to apply it. Take the convergence chapter, which I think you guys did a great job.
It's that 49%, 51% issue. 51% of the Army is quite content to say, here are the big ideas, here's how we think about conducting operations or doing X, Y, or Z, and then let me just roll with it. And then you got 49% that want a checklist. It would say, first you do this, then you do that, and then they want the playbook. And I'm being uncharitable. It's not 49%, but there's a somewhat vocal minority of people that say, hey, well, doctrine doesn't tell me how to do this. And it's like, well, we pay you to think, right? I'm not going to write your op order for you. The mission analysis and operations orders and concepts of operations and schemes of maneuver, or even campaign plans, that's all thinking man's work, thinking women's work. It's hey, you need to be grounded in the ideas. The rest of it's up to you. And I think that's our superpower, right? Because we have people that complain that, well, maybe you guys should classify your doctrine. The enemy can read it. We don't care if the enemy reads it. We want the enemy to read it. One, that acts as a deterrent function, because if they believe we can do these things, they might not screw around with us. And you could tell that by the way they imitate us. The other is that none of our commanders or staffs ever does anything the same way twice. Ever. Right? So, good luck trying to figure that out. We have trouble figuring out, how every, organization in the Army is trying to organize their command posts. The enemy's got no chance of figuring that out.
And I would say the message to those that are out there watching this podcast is Rich Creed drives the doctrine, the publications for the Army. Rich, you're very deliberate about ensuring we know we are writing this doctrine with you, and the feedback and iteration to the operational force is continuous. We just have to be deliberate about providing that feedback based on what we're seeing and doing. So that connective tissue, it is real between Combined Arms Center, the doctrine team, and the operational force. Because our doctrine is good, we just need to read it. That's what I wish I would have done more growing up. Now that it's got vignettes in there to help you get context, it's easier to read, frankly. You guys are doing a great job driving the ability to synthesize the information. The other one is, as we are transforming as an Army, it is the tremendous opportunity for us at Echelon to drive this transformation. There will be changes to doctrine that will come along. You just look at deep close rear areas, what that means for TIC-enabled units that have, if IMARs go to the division level, what's that mean to the division deeper? So doctrinal distances don't apply. We're going to have to adapt it like we are going to have to adapt all that we do to the mission at hand, the threat, the enemy, the capabilities we have, and the terrain that we have to do it in. And so for us, it's a non-contiguous environment. So it's a continual, as JFK said, learning and leadership are indispensable to each other. Leadership and learning are indispensable to each other. It's even more critical now based on how fast things are moving and the evolving character of war. And given that feedback to the doctrine team when units have it, and being deliberate about opening doors for the observers that come out, benefits not only your unit because you're sharing what you're learning and they're addressing it in doctrine, but the rest of the Army learns from it as well. So we're all getting better together, which I think is what everybody wants in Army, certainly Army senior leadership moving forward.
And sir, with the advent, kind of the rise of primacy of the Corps headquarters, would you mind sharing some of the insights, the conversations between yourself and the Corps commanders?
Yeah, certainly. Matter of fact, 3 Corps going through their warfighter right now. So talking through the multi-domain effect cell, they may call it something different, which punctuates Rich's point about, hey, you may have your own different TTPs and SOPs based on, your staff capacity and different skills that you have in the fight you have. But everyone is focused on how to optimize organization at Echelon to drive integration of this new technology across all the domains to enable the core fight. So that's a key one we're talking about. The other one is the different tools we have technically to provide command and control to decrease man hours required and increase the speed to need to kill things in terms of when you see it, how quick you can kill it, to help prioritize where the threat is and what you can kill based on available munitions. You could just keep going down the list. And so all the Corps are focused on optimizing the technology we have for command and control, the network, the transport, and the applications that connect all of our different systems to provide commanders decision dominance so you can make a decision quicker. And then the TIC effort is the other thing we are talking about. As the 101st is doing things with 18th Airborne Corps, and 25th ID is doing things, and we're driving our different warfighting forums, making we aren't stovepiped into a piece of equipment, but it's the warfighting capability of the entire formation based on what they got to do. So a lot of good discussion. As a matter of fact, I just got from Charlie Costanza, his Harding project. They have a newsletter they do in 5th Corps that's super helpful as we are trying to stay attuned of operations in Ukraine to make sure it's informing how we're transforming here in the Pacific. The fight won't go down exactly like the Ukraine, but what we're learning there will certainly inform how the fight goes down here against adversaries that we have if it comes to that. And so being deliberate to stay ahead of the technological changes and the capabilities and how to employ them the best way. We're learning a lot from U.S. Army, Europe, and 5th Corps.
Well, that's good. I didn't know about the 5th Corps newsletter, so we're going to get ourselves subscribed to that.
Sir, thanks for all your time. Is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners?
Yeah, first, if you're listening to this, it means you're interested in improving your professional capabilities or understanding and driving some self-development there. So good on you. You can't talk about our business of warfighting enough. As quick as things are changing around the world and what our adversaries, in terms of capabilities they're building, we need to be over communicating with each other. Things like the Harding Project, this podcast, help us stay connected and stay aligned as we're all driving quickly. I encourage you to understand what's going on in your left and right, because there's some great things going on across the Army, and we can be, on the great Oklahoma land grab instead of seeing a good idea that's already a year ahead of yours and just pulling it in to integrate that and then focus on the next thing. There's so much going on, and sometimes we can get stovepiped into just what our unit's doing. But figuring out ways we can pull those ideas and integrate them into what's right for your unit, your mission, and the environment you're going to fight in is incredibly important. So I'll end with thanks to both you, Dan, and Rich for doing this, but also what you do for Army and helping us memorialize the foundation for how we need to fight with our doctrine.
Hey, thanks a lot, sir. I mean, I can't add anything to that other than to say thank you both to First Corps and anyone in the audience from 3rd, 5th, and 18th Corps, because much like we have a very close relationship with your team, we've got a pretty good relationship with each of them as well. And our doctrine is only as good as the people who help us write it. And I think all the corps are committed to having their best thinkers, their most experienced people with the most relevant insights, contributing to making this body of our professional knowledge better. So appreciate your time here today. And look forward to coming out to talk doctrine and concepts and so forth with your team sometime in the upcoming year.
Awesome, Rich. Look forward to that and continuing to help our Army drive the progress we all want.
Gentlemen, thank you for your time today. To the listeners, today we've heard from Mr. Rich Creed, Director of the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate, and Lieutenant General Matthew McFarlane, Commanding General of America's First Corps, as they discussed Corps Echelon during large-scale combat operations. Lieutenant General McFarlane, thank you again for your shared insights, and as always, thank you for your leadership. As writing new doctrine is a team effort, breaking doctrine takes a team as well. Without the crew in the Special Doctrine Division here at CAD, we would not be able to bring you this show. Please don't forget to like and subscribe on Amazon Music, Apple, Odyssey, Audible, Spotify, or YouTube. You can also follow us on social media at U.S. Army Doctrine to get updates on new podcasts, Doctrine Digest videos, and publications. Finally, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the official position of the United States Army, the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command, or the Combined Arms Center. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Gregory, and this has been Breaking Doctrine.